Dramatic. Good morning, good to see you all. Maybe you could turn me down. What if I just do this? Is that better? Very good. Welcome back to the Priest and Rabbi Walk into a Classroom. Before we begin, Aaron and I like to have visual aids and fun. I had a visual aid at the sermon, and will later too. Aaron has a visual aid. If any of you are on Facebook, you can often see this is, little Aaron's first day of second grade. So you can
take your pictures the first day of the second year. You can take your pictures, right? All right, go ahead.
To mark he's already graduated. Yeah, he's very bright. We have those types of signs. Glad we could do that. As I said earlier in the announcements at 9 o'clock, that last year, which was 25 classes we did, was much more in my wheelhouse on the parables of Jesus. Had you studied most of the parables of Jesus before, Aaron?
I had not.
He had not. Very reasonably, he had not. So it was all new. And this year we're studying the book of Genesis together. I have studied that, but not anywhere like he has. So the tables have been flipped just a bit. Before we get into that, and we hope to work our way through large parts of the book of Genesis, there is a unique opportunity that is upcoming. The first one is this Thursday. Upcoming is the Jewish high holidays of Rosh Hashanah. Anybody know what Rosh Hashanah means? New Year. It's the Jewish New Year. And that the high holiday season concludes with Yom Kippur, which is what? The Day of Atonement. Have any of you been to Jewish high holidays before? Did most of you come when it was at Calvary several years ago? So here's something I learned. There is no average Episcopalian. We're all above average, we know that. But the average Episcopalian will go to church 2 minutes late, like from right on time to 5 minutes late on average. If they get in before the sermon gets going too far, that still counts, I think, in most people's mind. And they stay the whole time, which is about an hour. On a really big service like Christmas, Easter, it's an hour and 20 minutes, but about an hour. Now, the average Jew, also no such thing, that came to high holidays, absolutely does not do that. However, the average Episcopalian I observed stayed the entire time. They showed up right at the beginning and stayed like all 4 hours. That is really long to sit through. No matter how great the movie is or the show, that's a long time. Aaron has found a way to meet your needs. And that is, he is offering 2 services that will be at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, right on Highland, in their chapel. The first one is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, this Thursday. Friday. And how long is the service, Aaron?
90 minutes, max.
90 minutes, max. And you can come the whole time. And then Yom Kippur, I forget the date, is
Sunday the 24th.
Sunday the 24th, also 90 minutes max. And you can go to one or the other or both. How is the service all going to be in Hebrew?
Not exclusively, but you don't need to know anything to get a lot out of it.
And how would one dress to this?
You guys look great right now. So comfortably, casually, respectfully, but don't overthink it.
Is this for Jews only or Gentiles, or you're not sure how you identify anymore?
Right, everyone's welcome.
How do you get tickets for this?
You can go on the website. There's c4ic.org. It's on Eventbrite. But most importantly, just show up. If you want to buy tickets, that's wonderful. You're supporting the Center for Interfaith Collaboration, but mostly I want you to feel like you can come.
So Calvary members are welcome to buy a ticket, or you're welcome just to show up for free.
Yes.
Just to be clear to everybody. So if you want to just come to one or the other or both, you can just come and be there. Because the chapel holds a couple hundred people.
I think about 350 or something.
350. It's a lovely, very Protestant-looking chapel, but it's very lovely. Presbyterian chapel. Parking is ample. It's all behind to the side of the chapel. What else would...
That's pretty much it. I mean, all the other questions are on the website.
Yeah. Because we wanted to tell people... I'm going to go, by the way. It's not clear, if you've never done it before, what is this? That's what an opportunity to come participate in the high holidays, see what they're all about.
Right.
You're leading it, obviously, and preaching. How many sermons are in that?
One an evening. One per evening.
Wow. You get
So
like
2.
4 if you come to the other one. So one sermon generally is sufficient as far as I'm concerned.
It's enough.
If you can't say it in 15 minutes, you can't say it. That's my old motto.
I had my professor of homiletics and sermons said that delivering a sermon is like drilling for oil. If you haven't hit pay dirt in about 10 minutes, stop boring.
Yes.
That's cute.
Exactly.
It's cute.
I like that person a lot.
Yeah.
So what is the book of Genesis? It's the first book of the Bible, and it means obviously the beginning. That's what English speakers call it. What do Jews call the book of Genesis? Oh, don't know that one, do you?
We'll get that. Bereshit, it's called. Well, I'll get into it.
Go ahead.
Bereshit. I'll get us started. But we'll
Get us started.
So let's begin just with the blessing over study. Here we're going to learn something about our shared traditions. The blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. So we're engaged in study. In order to get to what we're going to be doing this season by looking at the book of Genesis, I want to start at the top of the funnel, if you will, and then zero in. So let's just get familiar with a few of the words that we bandy about and with which you'll be familiar, but I want to sharpen our acuity with regard to what we're actually speaking of. So let's talk about the Bible generally, from a high level. When you think of the Bible, or someone makes reference to the Bible, what do they refer to? What do you have in mind? The Bible. Typically, I'm guessing, you may have in mind a volume that includes essentially two group of books. One is referred to as the Old Testament, one is referred to as the New Testament. Is that fair enough? Right. That's what's understood by Christians or the world as the Christian Bible. Old Testament plus New Testament. We're going to leave the New Testament because that's above my pay grade, right? We're going to focus on the Old Testament. I'm going to teach you a word. The word is called retronym. Anyone know that word? R-E-T-R-O, retro, N-Y-M. Retronym. A homonym, words that sound alike, right? Antonym, words that are opposite in meaning. Synonym, words that have the same meaning. A retronym is a word or a phrase, a name that's coined and then put into use in light of something newer, such that we rename something older. That new name is called the retronym. Here are some examples. If you remember from your world history or European history, in 1917, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. It kicked off a conflagration that covered all of Europe, and that conflagration was known as what?
The Great War.
The Great War. It wasn't known as World War I until World War II, which makes World War I, that moniker, a retronym. We've renamed the Great War in light of the new and improved Great War, and so we renamed the Great War World War I. We speak of World War III, perhaps, in sort of a boogeyman kind of way, but to rename it. When a couple has the first child's a son, they give the boy the same name as the father. Because of Junior's arrival, the old man is now senior. Wasn't senior until Junior showed up, and so Bob Smith Sr., that moniker, is a retronym. Does that make sense? Another one. Sadly, this one's all too apt. It used to be when you went to go see the Pirates lose, you'd go to Forbes Field, right? And you'd go what time of day? You'd go during daylight hours because that's when games were played because there were not lights powerful enough to illuminate a stadium after dark. But once there were lights powerful enough such that you could play after sundown, that became the default time to play. Why? Because people were off of work, kids were out of school, you could make more money in the evenings, and so the default became to play in the evening. If you sneak out of the office in the middle of the day and go down to PNC Park today to watch the Pirates lose, and you do that at noon, we refer to that as a day game, right? But there was no such thing in nomenclature as a day game until there were night games. Old Testament is the same thing. No such thing as the Old Testament until we have a New Testament such that we rename the Hebrew Bible. For our purposes, we're going to refer to the Hebrew Bible as opposed to the Old Testament, but we're referring to the exact same corpus of books, okay? Because Old Testament is Christological in its using it as a reference point to the New Testament, which Jews don't recognize as sacred scripture or their own sacred scripture, right? So let's look at what the Hebrew Bible is comprised of.
That's a question. Question, because I've been asked this many times. Aaron, does it offend you if I say the Old Testament?
No, I don't take any offense. But in academic circles,
Yep.
It's not as precise, right? It's sort of like, same thing. BC, in terms of counting years, and AD, it's a Christian reference. So in academic circles, often it's BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. The numbering system completely matches up. It's just not using a religious referent to refer to the calendar. Okay? So no offense is taken. But pays to enrich your word power. Remember that section in Reader's Digest? Right? If you know the Old Testament is also the Hebrew Bible, a more sensitive way of referring to it when speaking with Jews is their Hebrew Bible. In truth, most Jews think of the Bible as the first section. So let's just talk about what is in the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible. It's comprised of 3 bodies of works. In Hebrew, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is made up of 3 parts. In Hebrew, it's an acronym. The acronym is Tanakh. That's the Hebrew phrase for the Old Testament for the Hebrew Bible. And it's an acronym for Torah, is the T. The N refers to Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for the prophetic books. A Navi is a prophet. Nevi'im is the books of the prophets. The next section, you know them as the Hebrew prophets, right? And the third is Ketuvim, which are the writings, which refers to Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and all the books that are later in the volume of the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is referred to in Hebrew acronym as the Tanakh, which references the Torah. We're going to get to that in a moment. The prophets, and then all the writings. And if you open up your Bible, you'll likely see that within the section on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, this division. Okay? You can ask questions at any time, anything at all. Let's focus on yeah, please, Jonathan.
So is this Tanakh? I already knew that word, by the way.
Good.
Is that Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the same as our Old Testament? Same books?
Exactly.
Same number of books?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's some slight variations between Protestant and Catholic arranging of some of the books, but the corpus is the same. Yes. The Pentateuch. That's a terrific place to get. The Torah, let me get you there. The Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible. That's the Pentateuch, right? The Pentateuch is the collection of the 5 books. It's a Greek reference, right? Much like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Those are Greek names for these volumes. The Pentateuch refers to the 5 volumes that Jews refer to as the Torah.
Penta 5.
Penta, 5.
Yep.
Yeah. What are those 5 books? Do you know them? Here's a quick way to remember them.
Ooh. I will not look, but I hope you know the first 5 books of the Bible.
But you will, if you don't.
Okay.
Okay. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here's a shorthand for those who like mnemonic devices. G, E, L, N, and D. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You can do one of 2 ways. You can do any number of them, I suppose. One is God's everlasting love never dies. The other is General Electric lights never dim. It's just a matter of whether right? But you could be on a quiz show any day now, and big money could hang in the balance. You've exhausted all of your lifelines. You have no friends to call, and you need to know the third or fourth book of the Bible to win the big money. You just need to remember that General Electric lights never dim. Okay, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Jews read the Torah all the way through annually. So our lectionary, the Jewish lectionary, is such that every year we go through the entirety of those 5 books, reading them publicly from the Torah scroll. I've become very interested in the last year or so the nature of lectionaries, how the selections are chosen, and which, if you came to an entire year of Episcopal worship, how much of the Bible would you actually be exposed to? What would you never actually hear publicly read? What gets read more than once? Or what gets read on certain holidays when attendance is greater? Those kinds of choices are significant in terms of what you take away, right? Or what you come to believe are the essential messages or truths about which the tradition around which the tradition is centered. For Jews, we read all the way through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in a sequential weekly reading cycle, right? So to the degree that I'm more familiar with Genesis than perhaps an Episcopal rector is because we perseverate on it, right? We read it over and over and over, these particular stories, and you get good at what you practice, and that's what Jews are most familiar with. They may not know it so well, but they know that that's what's happening through, such that everywhere in the world, in every Jewish community, on a given week, according to the scheduled cycle, we're all reading the same portion of Genesis sequentially into Exodus, all the way through Deuteronomy in an annual way. Questions so far, please?
So who wrote them?
Who wrote Genesis, or who wrote the Bible?
Who wrote the first 5? Who said what should be?
So real quickly, the mythos, the story is, as told in the book of Exodus, that Moses receives this transmission from God on top Mount Sinai. That's the traditional understanding. That what Moses received atop Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus is not simply the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments is another word. You learned retronym, a metonym, M-E-T-O-N-Y-M. Anyone know that word? A metonym is a part that represents the whole, right? That is to say, we do this all the time. It's one of my favorite ways of explaining it. If you were thoughtful enough to see a picture of my children, and I were to show you a picture of their faces, you would be satisfied that you had seen them. If, however, I were to show you a picture with them from the neck down, 90% of their body, it wouldn't satisfy. Because for human beings, the human face is a metonym for the person. And important fact, just to get a little bit push the envelope, when we objectify anyone and reduce them to body parts, where the part represents the whole person, we can find that very discomforting. Ugly, right? Sexist, all kinds of different things if we reduce people down to parts. But all of the time, we recognize that a portion will represent a larger piece. Another example, when the Air Force One lands in a foreign capital, the president gets off the plane represents the United States, right? The president represents the country. Those kinds of, we see metonyms all the time, right? So the 10 Commandments, which Moses gets atop Mount Sinai, is a metonym in the story for the entire Torah tradition. Now, where did it actually come from in point of fact? How is it that it came to be the body of literature that we know what it is? There are different schools of thought. The most widely accepted is what's called documentary hypothesis, which is there were different sources originally, and they got edited and redacted together. And we're going to see evidence of that in a few weeks' time when we compare different stories in Genesis. For instance, in Genesis 1, just to sort of tease you a bit, in Genesis 1, we have a creation narrative. You remember the creation narrative in Genesis 1, chapter 1? You remember the distinction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? Genesis 1, for a quick survey, posits a story where there's 6 days of creation and God rests on the 7th day. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's a completely different creation story. We may have conflated them in our minds, Adam and Eve in the garden wearing fig leaves and staying away from apple trees and snakes talking to them and the rest. We may have merged that with the idea of the six-day creation story, but they're actually two distinct stories, which we'll see in a few weeks' time, which suggests that they came from different sources at different points in history. Right? But hold on to the question. Don't be too satisfied with that answer. Yes?
So I don't want to leave this too far down a rabbit hole, but
Could you
Yep.
make sure to restate the question?
in the Christian tradition, there are those who say that the Bible, the New Testament, is the true and unerrant Word of God, all capitalized, not harmed by human hands.
Correct.
There are other Christians, some of us here, including me, say that it is inspired by the Word of God. Is there sort of a break within Jewish denominator or sects?
Yes. The point of departure, the question was, there are Christians who believe that the Bible is the unerring, infallible Word of God, and there are others, perhaps represented in this room, right, who believe that it's a document, the Bible, that was created by human beings at different times and brought these together. To oversimplify, is there such a distinction or a dichotomy in the Jewish community? And the answer is yes, and in point of fact, that's the point of departure in the 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, that distinguished Reform Judaism from Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism, we should just say, a little bit of Jewish history, is also a retronym. Before the late 1700s, the very end of the 18th century, 1810 is the founding of the first Reformed Jewish congregation. The Reformed Judaism came about following the French Revolution and the emancipation that began spreading across Europe. And once it was posited that two things were true. One, you were not going to be judged, this was the French Revolution, as a Jew out in the public, or we're not going to make distinctions based on religion by the state, but religion is a private exercise and experience, which is how we understand it in the United States. That's our notion of democracy. There's not officially a state religion, and we find it anathema, the idea that the government would in any way distinguish between Americans based on their religious affiliation. And, I'm going to get to Charles, and the idea that for the first time following the French Revolution and Jews being able to gain access to universities and being able for the first time to study religion, not for the purpose of becoming more expert in your own faith tradition, or not studying other religions because you're working your way up to through the priesthood, where you want to understand the roots of Christianity, you'll study Judaism for that purpose. Now, for the first time, people could take courses or could study religion the same way we study history or literature or anything else. The way if a child is at a college, at a university, and takes a course in religion, unless they're enrolled specifically in a religious school for that purpose of education, we understand that they're going to be exposed to, in this religion class at university, to religion as an academic discipline, as opposed to making you a better Episcopalian or a better Jew or training you for a professional role in the community. Once those two things happened, you were not going to be judged by your religion out in public, but it was a private concern. And once we could begin studying religion, the word is disinterestedly, you're not uninterested, but you're not doing it in order to become better in your own faith, right? Any more than if I take a course in Black history, African American history, or Native American history, or women's studies. I'm intending to become a member of that group. I want to better understand it. Once that happened, we were on our way to cleaving the two communities. And those Jewish communities that were liberalizing or modernizing or appreciating that we can study the development of Jewish law in light of Hammurabi's code, in light of other Middle Eastern traditions, in light of the history of jurisprudence, we can step back from the religion and understand it as a larger discipline. Once that happened, the idea was introduced that perhaps this wasn't written once and for all time, infallibly, immutably, atop Mount Sinai and handed to Moses. And those persons that accepted that idea and went in that direction, modernizing direction, if you will, were identified as the reformers. And once the reformers became a movement or became organized, such as it was, it's one of those oxymorons, right? Organized religion. It's not so clear that it actually exists. But once they began to cohere, they needed a name for their father's Oldsmobile, for the religion, that tradition they'd left behind, and that became Orthodox. So Orthodox Judaism itself a retronym, only about 200 years old or so. Does that make sense? That's a little bit counterintuitive. No one referred to themselves as an Orthodox Jew until there was a more liberalizing movement to distinguish itself from. Charles.
You said that Reform Judaism began after the French Revolution.
Yes.
Did it begin in France or in some other place?
It began in Germany.
Repeat the question.
Where did Reform Judaism begin? If it followed the French Revolution in the late 18th century, early 19th century, did it take its root originally in France, and the birthplace of Reform Judaism is considered Germany? Yes. Yes? It is another. So there were once the Reform movement came along and began to emphasize ideas like ethics over ritual. For instance, we're going to make a distinction, said the Reformers, between those laws that are in the Torah that are about ethics, paying your laborers on time, how we treat people, as opposed to the rituals that we look to distinguish or define who we are, whether it's keeping kosher, whether it's engaging in circumcision, whether it's observing Shabbat, the Sabbath, on Friday night to Saturday, or whether we should do it like the rest of the community and do it on Sunday. The rituals, the ways we drape and dress ourselves in order to practice our own religion, were distinguished from the ethics. That was a Reform Jewish movement. There were those who felt that these reforms were coming too quickly. We're at risk of throwing babies out with bathwater if we dispense with ritual, if we dispense with a sense of obligation or responsibility, if we're each autonomous individuals. And so those who wanted to conserve tradition became the conservative movement. So in terms of name, it was all Jewish. Doesn't mean they were monolithic, the community before the 18th century. They were more defined by geography and various practices, much like around the country. We might speak in different American English dialects, right? And only later, for various purposes, do we define this part of the country versus that part of the country. We speak of the South versus the West or the Northeast or that kind of thing. But Reform Judaism came along by name. It spawned a name for the more traditional adherents, the generations past, called Orthodox, and then there were some in the Reform camp who thought the changes were happening too quickly, and they made an effort to sort of strike a middle ground.
It's just like junior and senior.
It's just like junior and senior. Yes. All right, other thoughts about that? All right, so let's look at Genesis. So now we have the first book of the Torah. Hang on. See if you can see this schema with me. Here's the Torah. I'm sorry, not everyone's going to be able to see it so well. Right, there's the scroll. Everyone see my little schema? Can you see it? Okay. And then if we were to open it up, this scroll, okay, and we're going to divide it into 5 books, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Hebrew reads right to left, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We start at the beginning of Genesis, we read to the end of Deuteronomy, and in a year, we go back and cycle through. And each of these books is divided into smaller sections called portions, such that we know how much to read each week. When we celebrate, Jews, when we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, which means head of the year, we refer to it as New Year, right? Your Rosh is your head, and a Shana is a year, and so the head of the year is the New Year. That's the idiom. What is it that we're celebrating in Judaism when we celebrate the New Year? You know? Yes?
Starting to read the Torah over at the beginning.
It's close, and you would think so. It's not exactly the case. We started a couple weeks hence, but it's a great guess. When we think of calendars, and we begin counting from your date of your birth, right? Or on January 1, or whatever it might be. I went to PIMS, the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science, had its graduation on Friday in the church. And I think it was the 167th commencement exercise. What are they measuring? 167 years from what? When do calendars begin? They vary. There's not a single answer for that. What is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, celebrating? Do you know? Creation. The Jewish calendar posits, based on human intellect, that because of the way in which we understand how life works, you come into the world on a given day, you live a span of years, and then it comes to a terminus. the idea must be that a physical world must have similarly had a day where it came into being. That's the conceit. And we're going to celebrate that event. The event is essentially, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. And that's what, come Friday evening, we're going to celebrate with Rosh Hashanah. For just a point of information, the year that we're celebrating, about to begin, is the year 5784. 5784 is a fiction, right? It's a fiction in that, ostensibly, if you went back 5,784 years from Friday coming up, that would have been the day on which God said, let there be light, goes the argument. You and I understand the world is many times more aged, right? Older, that's the word. Older than some 6,000 years. We have this number because at some point in the Middle Ages, some Jewish sages decided we need to know what year we're in. We need to understand where we are in a time continuum such that if I invite you to lunch next week, we'll show up on the same day. Right? That's really what calendars do. It's sort of like the numbering system upon which you rely so that you receive your mail where you want your mail to go. Right? Or the number of your home, the domicile you live in, has a certain number assigned to it. But it's a fiction, right? That number and that street name, it was all made up just so we could locate you. That's all an address serves to do, is allow us to locate someone on a map. And if you know the right combinations of letters and numerals, and you put them on the front of an envelope with the right postage, it'll get there. That's the amazing thing about that numbering system, and the calendar works the same way. The day you believe is your birthday is in fact your birthday, but the fact that it's a Monday or a Wednesday, or the 17th of the month or the 30th of the month, is a made-up convention, a name we give to a given day so that we can all agree how old we are relative to things. And we know when to show up. If we agree we're going to show up on next Thursday, we all understand what that means. Or we're going to show up on the 10th of October. We all can agree on what that means. Given that the year now in the Gregorian calendar is 2023, what is that a measurement of? What ostensibly happened 2023 years ago? Jesus was born, right? Did it happen on December 25th in the year 0? If we'd known that it was 0, it's not important, right? We understand we suspend disbelief as to whether or not the calendar is actually the one we should rely on. What's important is that we all know what day of the year we get off and what day of the year presents are going to arrive and what day of the year we're going to have certain foods and invite people to our home or to the church and do certain things. So in the Christian calendar, the point of counting, or the distinction between before and after, is when Jesus comes on the scene. In Jewish calendrics, we're talking about when the world was created. Yes?
So again, not a radical necessarily, but I think it's interesting that Judaism was founded in the northern hemisphere.
Yes.
In an agrarian society, and they count the beginning of life at the time that light is actually starting to decrease substantially.
Say that again.
So it's towards the autumnal equinox, right?
Right.
Which is where you're going from summer, where you have 10 hours of sunlight a day, to equal, and then you're going. But you're talking about God said, let there be light in a time when there was decreasing light.
Oh, that's interesting. Everyone get that? The question was, it's very good, that, so I get this right. The Jewish calendar is based on the equinoxes and phase of the moon and the sun and the astronomical happenings. And we appreciate that, that there's greater amount of light in a given day during the summer and during, right? But come the fall, when we are asserting that God said, let there be light, we're actually on diminution.
Exactly.
Right.
So it would make more sense if you were really thinking all things were sensible, which they're not, that the beginning of the year would be in like March or April.
Right, and so the thought would be counterintuitive, given where we are. You might imagine that the Jewish New Year would begin in the spring, say, when light is going to increase, and there is actually a Talmudic argument debating when, in fact, should be the first of the year. Should it be on the first month of the year, which is in the spring, or should it be in the fall, when it says is the first of the year, but it's about the 8th or 9th month, the 10th month of the year, right? And it's a running debate in terms of what happened then. Some suggest that the world was conceived in the spring and was birthed in the fall. Or we're trying to take sort of a very human meta experience, living in our bodies, right? And trying to apply that or overlay that on a larger schema, which is a propensity human beings have and an intellectual fallacy. But the idea is, given our human propensity for wanting to have beginnings and ends to things, because that's how we understand the world, the idea that the world has always existed, or God has always existed, or that there's infinity to space, or these are concepts that are really challenging to embrace because they don't comport to what happens in math class, right? Or they don't comport to what happens in the Petri dish, right? Okay, yes?
In Christianity, there are beliefs that literal 6,000 years is how long the earth and the world is. In Judaism, are any of the Orthodox believe that that's a literal number, or do they see that that was just...
I think there are some who do see it as a literal number, right? They suspend disbelief and accept it at that. It's always been hard for me to imagine that an Orthodox Jew who has that belief could also be a physician and work in the world of science, right? Or could also, but we have ways, human beings do, of saying, well, this is what I believe, and this is the world in which I work, or this is, right? So yes, there is some of that. Essentially, we have this number because in the Middle Ages, they went back and counted up every reign of king and every length of life, and there were 40 days and 40 nights on the ark, and 40 days and 40 nights Moses on the mountain, and if you add all those up, well, then you get the idea that you're going back to this point in time, right? But it's sort of like the person who doesn't have a birth certificate or isn't certain about the date of their own birth. They still deserve to have a birthday every year, right? Right? Or the person who's born on February 29th. I mean, these are calendrical curiosities, but they don't change the fact that time moves forward, and we do ourselves a great benefit by remembering things that had happened earlier and commemorating them. Yes?
Well, this is in our world, but what if you're Chinese?
Right, you have a different calendar.
And do you agree with what year it is? Or
Well, let's agree that what we want to agree on is that we all have the same understanding of the date we're making reference to. Does that make sense? I mean, if I told you that this coming Friday evening, on the first of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, we're all going to be gathering at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for a service. You say, well, that's really very good, but I don't know anything about this month you call Tishrei. Can you translate that into English? Oh, yes, we'll be gathering on Friday the 15th of September. We all got it, right? Whether or not the date, the 15th of September, is a real date, or whether it's what we simply are going to call the Friday, it works as long as we all understand the nomenclature, right?
so it's amazing the world agrees on dates, then, isn't it? If you come from
It's amazing. Or time zones. I mean, think about that. As you look at a globe and you see all the time zones mapped out, and everywhere in the world, we can agree on that, it seems. Right? That everywhere in the world we agree that this date today has a certain number. And whatever system you're working in, we all share that agreement. You can come up with your own calendaring system and rely on it, but unless other people share it, it's not going to be very useful beyond yourself. Does that make sense? So I don't know the Chinese date for today. I don't even know the Chinese year until I go eat at a restaurant and it tells me on my placemat what year we're in. Right? Because it's not my counting system. The same, look, we do this all the time. Kids just began school, right? They're on an academic year. It has nothing to do with the January 1st cycle or the phases of the sun or the moon or anything else. And if you have a subscription or a series to a sports team or to a cultural district or activity that has a season, then you're on that cycle. And you keep track of your own birthday. Seems pretty good, right? We weren't all born on January 1, so we keep track in different ways. And you measure things based on your children or when you lived in a certain place. We do all kinds of different counting systems. Charles?
The New Year's fireworks are seen from Australia first,
Right.
and New Zealand, and then various places around the world before they come to New
Right, so we've all seen that, right? On New Year's Eve, if you watch the ball begin to drop in New York City, you know that for a number of hours earlier, this has been happening in a cascading way around the world. It's sort of exciting, right? Yes?
That's what happened when Rudolph turned to the year 2000. Everybody was on bated breath that, oh my God, everything's going to stop, every computer.
It could collapse, right?
I think it was Fiji who was first, and it kind of went across the world to see that everybody was, oh yeah, we're still online, we're good.
We're okay, right? Right. And we've all had the occasion, right, where you fly, I get confused, whether you fly east or you fly west, and then you go back a day or you lose time. It's a confusing thing, right? We've all played the little puzzle. If you go across the international date line, do you get younger? No, not really. It may feel like it's yesterday, right? Okay. So on Rosh Hashanah, we're celebrating the birth of the world, which is where Genesis begins. That's what I want to suggest. Yes?
Why do I think of Rosh Hashanah as a harvest festival?
Because it happens in the fall.
Oh, and then you build a little,
Well, so that's the next holiday after Yom Kippur is Sukkot, where you build the temporary booths and you hang it with fruit and things of that sort. No, that's called Sukkot. It follows Yom Kippur. Yeah, but there's sort of a string of holidays that come in the fall, and they all get sort of lumped together, right? Okay, so now we're in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Torah, which is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, which is the first book of the combined Old and New Testament biblical tradition, and it begins with the creation of the world. The idea is that God's calling card, if you will, is the creation of the entire universe. That's the presupposition with that idea. And we then get, through the course of Genesis, a series of stories that take us through essentially generations, subsequent to Adam and Eve and their children, then Noah, and then going forward. And we're referring to essentially the greatest hits. So we're going to look at some of those stories. And we get, in addition to what I refer to as that ethnography, for the history of the people or how it came to be developed, such that there's a plumb line we can draw back to the beginnings. We also get a series of ethical teachings that come to define the Hebrew Bible and Genesis. The most significant early ones is that all of human beings have been created in the divine image, right? Whether or not it's true that the world came into being the way Genesis describes, whether or not it's accurate that it happened in the order in which it's described, we have these ethics that we take from it also that then become the foundation for what we refer to as Judeo-Christian morality. Other questions? I thought I saw someone. All right. What else I want to say? I want to say this. Jonathan asked about the names of the books of the Bible. Hebrew tradition, Jewish tradition, gives its name, or let me say it differently. Jewish tradition names each of the books of the Bible, and within each of those books, the various sections that are read on a weekly basis, those books and those sections take their name from the first significant word in the text. It's not unlike the way we alphabetize titles of books in English. If you have a book that has the title The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, we learned in school that you file that under A for adventures because the word the simply isn't significant enough to give it pride of place under the T's. We go to the next word. The Hebrew Bible works the same way in terms of giving the names to the books and names to the portions. So the first word in the Hebrew Bible, the first word in Genesis, in English, we translate it, is Bereshit. Bereshit, which is the first word, you may hear the word, the resh, as in Rosh, it's the start, it means beginning, in the beginning. Bereshit, in the beginning, in the head of things, if you will. Rosh Hashanah, Reshit, same idea, same root, in the beginning, and that's the word that gives its name to the book. Genesis is a nice Latin way, Greek way, of saying beginnings. So it's the same thing. In Hebrew, the word for the book of Exodus is Shemot, which means names, because it begins with a series of names, and that's the first significant word, so we refer to that book as Shemot. But the essence of the book is about leaving Egypt, and so the Greek name is Exodus. Okay, that's simply how that works. And we begin moving from the creation of the world and those ideas into a story of these different families and clans, such that we have a story that traces its way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, or so that we have a common tradition in Noah and the Tower of Babel and the rest, right? Okay, I want to anticipate your questions, but is there something else that I should say just about how we get into the book of
What
Michael?
is the polite way to greet a Jewish person on Rosh Hashanah?
Oh, that's a nice question. So Shana Tova is the traditional greeting. Shana is year, and Tova is good. So a good year or sweet year, that idea. So Shana Tova is, or Happy New Year, but is usually the traditional greeting.
Like,
Michael, please.
The beginning that we get in Genesis is really not the beginning, not the organization of the world. And in fact, there are things that pre-exist the beginning. The waters are there, materials, the earth is there. And we don't know when that, and God has always been there. God didn't begin. So prior to the date, 57, whatever it is,
Yes.
everything didn't begin then, just the organization of the world insofar as it concerns human beings is when, and we don't know what happened before that or how long it happened.
So let me teach you something. Did everyone hear the question or the comment? The comment was that I asserted that Genesis, or in the beginning, let there be light, was the creation of the universe. Michael suggesting that there was still matter that preceded that, the waters, the heavens, God's self. And so it's a bit self-referential to say that, or self-important perhaps, or solipsistic, as if the world revolves around us, to say that because human beings came into the world, that's when things started, which is the conceit that each of us has at some level, at some point early in our lives, right? It's just hard to imagine that people did just fine before we showed up, right? Or that our parents had full lives before we showed up. Hopefully they still had full lives after we came along. But, right, that there was what before us. It's sort of it sort of buggers the mind, not unlike the world will go on without us. Wow, that's a scary idea. That sort of undermines the sense of my being the center of the world, right? So there is that. And there's a Talmudic argument, not unlike whether or not it should be in the first month of the year, in the spring, when there's more light versus the fall, but whether or not creation, or whether or not Rosh Hashanah, actually celebrates the creation of human beings as opposed to the world itself, right? So in some ways, all of these questions are really lovely and important because they come out of our own effort to understand what we're talking about. The important piece I want to share with you is not that we all understand that we're celebrating exactly the right thing, so much as choosing to pause to celebrate or reflect is what gives our life dimension and meaning, right? I mean, even the fact that we gather today on Sunday is a fiction. It only works because we all agree that today is Sunday. Does that make sense? What if we all learn tomorrow that, whoa, we've been off by 24 hours for about 2,500 years now, and actually today is Monday? Well, would we gather in 6 more days, or would we gather again in 7 more days? And the answer is probably we'd keep doing what we're doing, right? I had a professor in rabbinical school who said, we were studying the laws of Passover and the rest. He said, if we were to discover tomorrow morning, archaeologists in the Middle East were to unearth something that made it clear that the exodus from Egypt never happened. The Passover story is clearly made up out of whole cloth because we now have a document unearthed from the Arabian desert that proves we're not celebrating the right thing. The likelihood is great that we would next year have a Passover Seder in the same way we always have. Because that's how we understand ourselves. Does that make sense? So yes, and, right? At some level, it's a bit self-referential to believe that we understand when to celebrate this. But the more important piece is that we pause to do just that. That's what I suggest. Okay, what else do I want to say from a high level about Genesis?
We just have a couple more minutes, so we have time for a question or two. How many chapters are in the book of Genesis as Westerners count it?
I think it's 51.
Yep. What are the first 11 chapters about? Anybody know?
Help us.
It feels like 2 different books. That's partly why I'm suggesting that. The first 11 chapters of all the background Aaron's given are what we might call cosmic history, where the world comes from, some of these really big epic stories. And then from chapter 12 through 51, it changes, and it becomes about one, like an extended, like long, if you think of it almost as like, if you're watching something on PBS Masterpiece, this 10-part series where it's the family history over generations, that's what Genesis 12 through 51 is. It's a story of a people. Take a wild guess which people it's the story of. The Israelites. What's the difference between a Hebrew, a Jew, and an Israelite? Rabbi?
So I had a professor in rabbinical school who referred to that question, he referred to it as the Hij, H-I-J, Hebrew Israelite Jew. Because the nomenclature's changed over time depending on different realities, right? Where they lived, what was going on. And essentially, so some of them are anachronistic, right? To refer to, some are wrong. Israelites are not Israeli. That would be wrong, right? An Israeli is a citizen of the state of Israel. An Israelite is one who traces their lineage back to the ancient Israelites. Sometimes they're Hebrews, sometimes they're Israelites, and only later are they referred to as Jews, those from Judea. The word Jew actually doesn't show up in the Torah at all. Right?
So who are the main characters? What family? You referenced it briefly earlier.
Abraham. Yeah.
Abraham.
Isaac.
Do you ever, so how we do this in Eucharistic prayer C, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here all the priests add Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. So as the patriarchs and matriarchs, you could think of them as Christians, as our ancestors as well. I assume the Jews do that?
Yes.
A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. That is, we come, at least mythologically, and then genealogically, you say, we have the same cousins, the same ancestors. If you go back far enough, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel are also our ancestors, because therefore, that's also our story. Does it belong to the Jews? Absolutely. But is it also a big enough story that other people belong to it? I think so, absolutely. So is it come from that tradition? Yes, but other people make it their own. It's almost like St. Paul will talk about this, being adopted in or grafted in is the example he uses to that covenant. Because that is ultimately what it's about, is God creates the universe and then this people that are in a covenant relationship. And here's how they live that out over generations. In really hard times, like being slaves in Egypt, when they triumph over an enemy, you see, it's, by the way, it is, I would say that the Bible is at least PG-13, if not R-rated, because you get in there like, oh my God, how could this, he shouldn't have this stuff in there. There's lots of brutal wars. There is rape, adultery, incest. One king of Israel sees this hot woman up on the balcony, and she's like, oh, I got to have her. Who's she? Oh, good. I'm going to send her husband off to battle to get killed. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. That sounds like that stuff would happen today. Who is that king, by the way? David. Well, he's supposed to be good. They're regular people. By regular, I mean ordinary people that are good and bad and have mixed motives, but yeah, they're all still trying to be faithful to that covenant. So it's a really fantastic story that's very specific in some places, and that gets very grand, epic narratives in others. So next week, there is no class, because remember, Tree of Life High Holidays, one service at 5:30. 2 weeks from today, we start in the beginning.
We do.
With the first story, Genesis 1:1. So if you could read Genesis chapter 1 2 weeks from today, that'd be great. Anything else for the group? Aaron earned his money today. May we thank him? Thank you all. See you in 2 weeks.
Happy New Year.
You're taking up the license, right?
I appreciate that.